All right, so like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about exploring disability rights. And I like to start my presentations with some community agreements because we are using a shared space. Just want to make sure that we start off on the same page. So first off, being present. I appreciate you all being here, and we'll only be here for an hour. So try to be present, which leads into the next part of participation. I'll have some questions, and I hope you all have questions as well. So again, feel free to post those questions in the chat box or raise your hand and unmute yourself. Active listening. So there's a lot that I'll be saying, but other people might share as well. And so again, it goes back to just being present, open and honest communication. So please feel free to share your experiences and feelings that you have, but as a reminder to be respectful when making those comments. Embracing discomfort. So sometimes the topics that we're talking about, you might pause and not know about it, or it might feel like maybe something that you haven't heard before, and that's totally okay. So embracing that discomfort, and that allows opportunity to grow and to learn. So that's what I have for you all in terms of our community agreements. Are there any others that you all would like to add to this? All right, so I don't hear anything from you all, so I'm gonna take that as a no, and we'll get started. And how I wanna start is asking you all the question of, how would you define a disability? And what types of disabilities are there? So I'm just trying to get a sense of where folks are. So if you want, you can either post in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself and share. So how would you define disability, and what types of disabilities are there?
I would define disability, there's different ways to define it, but I've also heard like the social model of disability, which is that some disabilities only exist because society is not accommodating to them. So, for example, like someone who's a wheelchair user may not be considered disabled if they had, in a perfect world, could access everything. And so certain disabilities are only disabilities because society makes them harder to live with because it's not accessible for people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I really appreciate that answer because it's absolutely right. We have the opportunity to make our spaces accessible, however, they're not. And so by allowing that barrier to exist, we as a community do allow for, you know, folks with disabilities to not have access to certain things. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share how would they define a disability? What types of disabilities do you know about?
I'm pretty quiet. Hi, but you know, disability, basically anything that limits us from participating in what everything words in what is presumed typical. I'm trying to use not the therapist speak, but the global speak. But you know, we as a society, everything is produced in a typical way. Anytime we do an assessment on an individual, we are looking at what typical functioning is in whatever area of development that is. And a disability is when you are not performing or being able to be in that typical way. It's not necessarily stereotype, but we have, when these tests and when these assessments, I work with early childhood, when these tests and assessments were created, we knew what typical functioning and grand, in the grand scheme of things. And I think that we're finding that things are changing, and what may have been a disability at one time is now starting to become a little bit more normal, depending on the disability, obviously, but based on what other societal and outside factors, environmental factors are coming into play. So.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And absolutely, when we think about disabilities, our understanding and how we view disabilities has definitely changed over time. And we'll talk a little bit about what that history has looked like. So this definition is coming from the CDC. So they define a disability as any condition, any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. And both of the responses that you all gave touched on that definition. So looking at the CDC and how they define a disability, they lay out a couple different types. So we have mobility, cognition, independent living, hearing, vision, and then self-care. So I wanted to give you all some numbers when it comes to those different types of disabilities. Excuse me. So currently, there are over 60 million adults in the United States that has some sort of disability, which is 1 in 4 US adults. That's a lot, which I think is great, because then that means that we are that person, or we know and love someone that is that person. When it comes to mobility, the way that it's defined is someone who has a serious difficulty either walking or climbing up the stairs. And so almost 14% of that 60 million, that's what makes it up. So we're ranking them from highest to lowest in terms of number of people who have this disability. So mobility would be the number 1. And then number 2 would be cognition, which is a difficulty with concentrating, making decisions, or remembering things. And that would be 10.8, so about 11% of people with disabilities. Next, we have independent living. So that would be difficulty doing errands alone, and that's at about 7%. Hearing, so either complete deafness or difficulty hearing, and that's at 6%. Then we have vision, and you can see these great glasses that I have on right now, which will be blindness or serious difficulty seeing, and that's at 4.6%. And then the last one is self-care, which would be difficulty either bathing oneself or dressing oneself. And that comes in at almost 4%. So that's the way that the CDC has laid out disabilities, and just some numbers for us to think about. But one that really struck me was the fact that 1 in 4 US adults has some sort of disability. Questions on this slide before I move on? Someone asked about mental health, and that also falls under the cognition, and is a category for disability? That's a good question.
And this is Jeff. I would just bring out that this is not necessarily permanent, all including permanency. You could fit into one of these categories on a temporary basis and be a fully able-bodied person before and after.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Jeff. Some people are born with a disability. Some live life and then experience this disability. And as Jeff mentioned, that they might fully recovered and then they may no longer have that disability. And that's actually tied into the history a little bit, as we'll see on this next slide, because a lot of the early advocacy work that came with disability rights started with veterans from World War I and World War II, because they were able-bodied folks, but then as a result of the war became disabled. So let's talk a little bit about this history. In the 1800s, and less now, but we still see it, is that folks with disabilities were stereotyped. They were seen as abnormal, feeble-minded, pitiful, disgraces to the community, right? They were shunned from the community. And they were seen unfit and unable to contribute to society. So because folks thought they were unable to contribute to the society, they basically cast them to the side. The only time in the 1800s that we saw folks with disabilities is when they served a purpose to be ridiculed. So basically to be made fun of, or to be objects for entertainment, right? Oh, look at that, look at them. And that's not okay, but that's kind of where we started. And because of this, like, as I mentioned before, they were kept hidden, pushed away, and our community wanted them to be seen as invisible. So what did we do? We put these folks in institutions and into asylums. And what we also did, and I'm not sure if folks joined on before when we were talking about Indigenous folks, is that sterilizations happened. The reason why these sterilizations happened is because our society did not want folks with disabilities to be able to reproduce, right? If we don't like these things, if we don't like these people, we're going to sterilize them so that they cannot reproduce. And then they will no longer continue to exist in our society. And that ties in with a previous presentation, which you can find on the YWCA McLean County's website, but how they did that to Indigenous folks for the same reasons. They did not like Indigenous folks, and they did not want them to exist any longer, so they forced sterilizations. And we found out recently that sterilizations are continuing to happen to Indigenous folks, to Black and Brown folks as well in this current day. So moving from the sterilizations, the institutions trying to make folks with disabilities invisible, not seen to our society, or try to eliminate them in totality, we get to the early 1900s, where we see that people with disabilities have pushed for some rights. So having the identity seen as just part of a person, not the whole person. And you may notice that when I'm talking about these folks, I say people with disabilities because they are people first. and their disability is only one part of who they are. It is not completely who they are. And so this early push, as I mentioned before, started with World War I. So looking at 1914, and it was because of veterans who became disabled because of the war. So they pushed for state and federal government to provide help. And then moving from there, about 15 years later, we have President Franklin Roosevelt, and he actually had a disability. So he was our first president who had a disability. But what's interesting is that he still thought of people with disabilities as abnormal and shameful. So even though he had a disability, he looked down on people who had a disability. Then we move about another 15 years later into the 1940s when we have World War II. And they again are pushing for rights for people with disabilities, looking for medical attention, looking for vocational training, things of that nature. Then we get to the 1960s, where we see a lot of fight for social justice, and specifically the civil rights movement. And so there, people with disabilities joined forces with the civil rights movements to try to advance their rights and their needs and their wants as people. And that fits very well in with the civil rights movement because that's what it was about. So we've got the 1960s, people are building coalitions, building forces, and trying to advocate for each other's rights. And then finally, in the 1970s, disability rights advocates lobbied to Congress and marched on Washington, went to Washington, and to include language in the Rehabilitation Act. So on the screen you see it says 1973. What they wanted to do was amend the 1972 Rehabilitation Act to include language that was specific to people with disabilities. And so that's how we get the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which includes language to protect people with disabilities by the law. And so this was the first time that we saw that in our US history. And I don't know about you all, but 1973 seems too late, right? And too recent for these folks to get any sort of protection by the law. And in addition to that, which comes to this next part, which is 1990, which we see the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was passed on July 26th, and going forward, I'll just call it the ADA, but Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of their life. So whether that be in the workplace, whether that be in schools, whether that be in transportation, public, private, people with disabilities have protection under the law. And so this law was passed to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as people who do not have disabilities. So what I'm going to do is just pull up this infographic, if you may, that does a good job at summarizing the ADA. So we've got 5 parts. The first part is employment. So it says helps people with disabilities access the same employment opportunities and benefits. The second part is public services, so state and local government. This prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. The third part is public accommodations and services operated by private entities. So if you, the second part says state and local, but then the third part is private entities. So you can't discriminate against individuals with disabilities. And it says making sure that they have access to hotels, restaurants, doctor's offices, anything you can think of. The fourth part is about telecommunications. So making sure that people who are deaf or hard of hearing or who have speech disabilities can communicate over the phone. So like providing closed captioning. And then the last one just says miscellaneous, but is basically there to make sure that any other part that they might have missed in the first four parts are covered in that last part. Oh no, you all can't see it. Let me go back. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll go back. So this is from the National Network, Information Guidance and Training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I believe you all can see it now. Yes? Okay, great. So again, employment, Title I, Title II, public services, Title III, public accommodation, Title IV, telecommunications, and then Title V, miscellaneous provision. So I will copy and paste this into the chat so that y'all can reference it afterwards. Okay, questions or comments before we move on to a different slide? So that's a little bit of a background in history. All right, then we'll move on to the next slide. So what are some current issues that are facing, or that people with disabilities are facing now? We have education, employment, healthcare, housing, voting, and transportation. So unfortunately, people with disabilities are still experiencing discrimination in basically all areas of life. So any part of your life that you could think of, folks with disabilities are still experiencing discrimination. But I just wanted to highlight a couple for us to think about. So thinking about education, right now, one of the most current things is that our Congress has asked or has requested our Secretary of Education, who is Betsy DeVos, that she create waivers. Oh, I'm sorry. That she create waivers to allow schools to drop any services that are provided to students with disabilities during the pandemic. So meaning Congress wants schools to be able to not provide services to students with disabilities during COVID-19. That is not acceptable. Students should have access to education regardless of if they have a disability. And especially during a pandemic, right? This school seems to be the only time that folks are able to communicate with one another, interact with other people. So it's just not right. Looking at employment, so, another thing about our education system as well is that some of the tactics that schools are using against students with disabilities have been found to be abusive. So tactics like seclusion or some of the restraint tactics that they use have been found to be abusive. And again, no one deserves to be abused, period, but especially children. Again, our school systems can do better, and there's some that are, but there are unfortunately some that are not doing the right thing. Looking at employment, many people who have disabilities are either unemployed or underemployed. And if they are employed, they are being paid typically less than minimum wage. And unfortunately, that's something that businesses and companies can get away with. And people with disabilities deserve to make a fair wage. They're doing they're doing their work, and they deserve to be paid equally for the work that they are doing. Looking at housing, most people with disability lack either affordable or accessible housing. I do not have a physical disability, but I couldn't imagine trying to find housing if I did. Housing, even here locally, is, as a single person, is unaffordable. And then to imagine that I would be making less than what I currently make if I had a disability, and then trying to look at housing, and now my options are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller when it comes to what I have available to me to get housing. And so what we end up seeing is, unfortunately, a lot of folks who are homeless also have a disability. And those two things correlate. I skipped one, looking at housing, or healthcare, I'm sorry. One, and this was hard to read. So when it comes to healthcare, 1 in 3 adults with a disabilities has an unmet healthcare need because of cost. So 1 in 3 people with disabilities have not received healthcare for an issue that they have because of cost. That again ties back into the employment point that we made. And folks should be able to receive healthcare, right? They shouldn't have to be worried about if they can afford that healthcare or not. Looking at voting, and that's something that is important, and make sure y'all get out to vote early if you can. But access to voting is a huge issue for folks with disabilities. And then the last part is transportation, and we'll touch on a transportation and how that affects people in our community with disabilities. But when it comes to transportation, oftentimes transportation for folks with disabilities is either unavailable, so completely you just can't access it, inaccessible, and then unequal. So what I'm going to do is touch on a current issue. Now, I'm not sure how many of y'all are familiar with Connect Transit and what happened a year ago now, so in the spring of last year. But there was a lot of conversation around Connect Transit, and they provide public transportation to folks in the Bloomington-Normal area. And so there were a couple of decisions for Connect Transit and our local officials to make when it came to how Connect Transit would provide transportation to people with disabilities, older adults, things like that. And the choices that they made negatively impacted people with disabilities. So kind of on a timeline, you have the Normal City Council who voted to increase costs for riders with disabilities. Some people with disabilities use Connect Mobility, and a typical fare, if you were using like the bus, would be $1, but if you were using Connect Mobility, it would cost $2. So out the gate, it's already more expensive to use transportation if you have a disability. But then Connect Transit and the Normal City Council decided to increase the cost for both like types of ways to use Connect Transit. But for, if you're just using the bus, it would be increased to $1.50. If you were using Connect Mobility, it increased from $2 to $3. So you've not only been impacted by an increase in fare, but your impact is even greater. And we mentioned before that you are more likely to be either experiencing poverty, be unemployed, or underemployed. So that increase in cost heavily is it is impacting you more so than it would a person without a disability. Then they eliminated the 30-day passes, which would over time increase how much money then you were spending on a Connect Transit fare. What we see happen next is that they eliminate the Olive Route. And I'm gonna show y'all a couple of images of what our bus stops look like and how they are inaccessible. We then find out after Normal City Council makes these changes that community members reached out to the city council to say, hey, we either are in favor of this change or we oppose these changes. But those emails, not all of those emails were given to city council members beforehand. There was about, what they found was about 40 emails that were withheld and not given to city council members until after they took a vote. And that's not okay, right? Our city council are representatives for us, and they need to be able to hear our voice when we have concerns. And unfortunately, those concerns weren't voiced to our representatives. And it could have potentially had an impact on what the city council would have voted. Someone put inadvertently withheld, and yes, you're absolutely right. And then the last part that when we're thinking about transportation locally and with people with disabilities, there's a Connect Transit board that is made up of some local residents. And so there were some vacancies on this board, and community members pushed to fill that board with a person with a disability, because that only makes sense, right? You should be able to have representation on a board that is going to impact your life. That also did not go well, but that doesn't mean that the fight is over. We can still, you know, push to have folks with disabilities on the board and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of what we can do. But I have a couple of pictures. Well, I guess I'll pause there before I show you all some pictures. Are there any questions? So someone asked, is the Connect Transit board that makes the rules for our buses, and Normal Town Council doesn't oversee that? So what I understand to be true is that both the town of Normal and the city of Bloomington oversee Connect Transit, but they also have a board as well. So it's kind of like a team effort when it comes to how Connect Transit operates. And I can find all the nitty-gritty details if you want me to afterwards and send them to you, but that's how I best understand it.
I just had a question about the olive route. What was significant about that? I've only been here for like a year, less than a year and a half. So I was wondering like what was significant about the olive route.
Yeah, so when they eliminated the olive route, what it did was once they cut that route out, it made it an even further trek for folks to access a bus stop. It made it like over half a mile for people to access a bus route. And that was like crossing Main Street. And another very popular street. So just unsafe and then increasing that. And it was already kind of a far trek for people to even access the olive route. And then what we see is this intersectionality of it was affecting older adults, folks with disabilities, and then particularly where this route was, it was a lot of Black and brown folks that lived there. So there was just a lot of over when they eliminated that route.
Cinnamon, if I could chime in there regarding the olive route that was cut. This affected my particular community incredibly. Though I'm not a bus rider, I am very familiar with this route because where they cut it, the Boys and Girls Club area was affected. Low income housing with Sunnyside residents were affected. We have lots of elderly that live in my quiet community over there, but we also have a lot of teens who were using that route to access employment. And then when it was cut, it was incredible. It created this barrier to those youth being able to have what little options they may have had to gain some form of income and to keep themselves gainfully employed and help many of their families. So this particular route cut impacted the community significantly, and I don't think it was given enough attention.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And someone posted in the chat that olive route was the only way to access the senior center and the local unemployment office as well. So here are what some of our bus stops look like, and you all let me know, do these look accessible to you? So here's the first two that we have. The first one does have a sidewalk near it, but if I was a person that had to use either a wheelchair or had to use a scooter or even a walker, how would you access that bus stop? And this is springtime, so imagine when it's wintertime. We know what the snow gets like here. Then we look at the second image. The bus stop is behind a guardrail. So again, I don't know how you would access the bus from there, and there is no sidewalk. So if I needed to be by that bus stop, I would basically be in the street. Two more for you. I think the first one is pretty self-explanatory. There is a huge body of water there for someone trying to access the bus. And again, there's not a sidewalk. And you can clearly see if they had to access it, they would have to be in the middle of the street somewhere. And then this last one, it's on a bed of rocks. So I have ideas about what it looks like, but what do you all see from these bus routes?
Yeah, there's clearly an access issue. Anyone who had a wheelchair or had mobility issues wouldn't be able to access the bus or wouldn't be able to remain safely out of traffic. One of those two issues.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When I see these images, I think about the potential for more harm being caused. Trips, falls, equipment that they may be using that may malfunction as a result of the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this example, we're talking about, folks who have a mobility disability, but yeah, absolutely. This is just one example of the many that we have when it comes to access for folks with disabilities. Someone else posted in the chat that they could possibly have to use other forms of transportation, maybe like a cab or taxi, etc., which would be more money. And again, that goes back to the whole economic point that we made. And then someone else said the stops force people with disabilities to utilize the more expensive mobility service. All right. So we laid out some of our issues, and there are more to discuss, but just kind of as an overview. The next thought should be, well, what can we do, right? So one of the things that we can do is talk about accommodation. So we talked about employment when it comes to folks with disabilities, and when we think about our workplaces, one thing that we need to talk about and do something about is accommodations. So I have a short video for us to watch that talks about accommodations.
Everyone needs the right to.
Hi everybody, this is Kay Gray, and today I have my top 10 accommodations to ask for.
I don't know what I clicked on.
Everyone needs the right tools to perform a job. Chairs for.
Hi everybody, this is Kay Gray, and today I have my top.
Everyone needs the right tools to perform a job. Chairs for employees who work at desks, ladders for roofers who need to get on top of a house, even lunch breaks for people who need food to get through the day, like we all do. It makes good business sense to have a workplace that accommodates everyone's needs. And laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act are there to make sure workers with disabilities are accommodated too. So, what kind of accommodations are we talking about? Special privileges for special people, right? Gold-plated hover chairs? Trained seeing eye unicorns? Not even close. Turns out employees with disabilities aren't particularly special, and neither are the accommodations they need to do their jobs. In fact, they're pretty reasonable. Literally, it's why the ADA calls them reasonable accommodations. An accommodation is any change in the environment or in the way things are done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal opportunities to work. Miguel works as an office assistant, and his low vision makes using a computer monitor difficult. So his employer provided screen reading software that reads aloud on-screen text and image descriptions. That's a reasonable accommodation. June is a bookkeeper who experienced a traumatic brain injury. Concentrating for long periods of time is exhausting for her. So instead of taking one long break, her employer allows her to take several short breaks. That's a reasonable accommodation. And according to the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, the majority of workplace accommodations, 59%, cost absolutely nothing. But if there is an expense, there are tax credits and other incentives out there to support businesses in creating a more accessible workplace. So how do you go about getting a reasonable accommodation? You're the expert on what you need. So if you need something, ask for it. Step 1, research simple solutions. While you may be the only employee at your job with your disability, odds are that someone somewhere has the solution you're looking for. Resources like JAN have whole catalogs of useful real-life solutions to learn from. Step 2, notify your employer. Notifying your employer of your need for an accommodation starts the process, whether you speak with them or send them an email. You may need to provide a medical letter or other documentation if requested. You do not need to tell your employer everything about your disability, just how it might affect your job duties. Step 3, negotiate. Finding the right accommodation is not a one-step process. It's an interactive back and forth conversation. Your employer may propose a different accommodation than the one you suggested. Consider whether their idea would be effective, or make another suggestion. And you may need to propose more than one accommodation before finding the one that works for everyone. Step 4, approach a higher level colleague. If your employer rejects your requested accommodation without making an alternative offer, or if your employer refuses to discuss your request, communicate your request to a higher level individual, like your supervisor's manager or the HR department. It is a good idea to keep notes about who you spoke with and the date. If all else fails, there's step 5, file a claim. If you're not getting anywhere with the higher-ups, there are agencies that can help. Filing a claim involves a lot of paperwork and sometimes short deadlines, so it's important to move quickly. No matter what steps you take, always remember that asking for reasonable accommodations is not about getting special favors. It's about getting what you need to get your job done. For more information, contact the National Disability Rights Network at ndrn.org.
So accommodations, excuse me, something for us to think about and start doing something about. And then advocate, whether it's for ourselves or for folks with disabilities. We can advocate in numerous ways. And so 2 of those ways are to talk to our elected officials and our community. I saw someone post that local companies could sponsor a bus stop, right? That is something that we can all be involved in and pitch in with. And then lastly, talking with our community of people with disabilities. So, find events, find organizations, find different ways for you to make sure that people with disabilities have the rights that they need and that they deserve. So some resources are LifeSil, so that is local, Life Center for Independent Living. And then we have Mark First, and they serve people with disabilities. So both of these places would be great contacts if you had more questions, if you were looking for ways to get involved. And then one other organization that is local, and I know some folks who are involved in this, is the Penguin Project. But what they do is they get kids and teens and people with disabilities involved in acting and theater, and then they put on performances for our community, and it's great. So definitely check out some performances. I know COVID is changing some things up, but just be on the lookout for the Penguin Project. And then mention in the video, but also where I got some of this information from was the National Disability Rights Network. Someone said that it's important to involve people with disabilities in the conversation, and that is absolutely right. People with disabilities know what they need, they know what they want, and what we need to do is listen to their voices and support them in what they're saying and the choices that they're making. So absolutely, thank you for sharing that. And someone else posted goinghomeillinois.org, and that it's a group that advocates for the closure of 7 institutions in Illinois that houses people with disabilities. And it says that Illinois still has the most number of institutionalized people, second only to Texas. So that's important for us to know. And that's another great way for us to get involved. I wanted to end on this video. So while you're watching this video, think about some takeaways, and I'll ask for some folks to share. Or maybe not. Let's see. Give me one moment here.
When I was 2, I was diagnosed with an extremely rare form of dwarfism, metatropic dysplasia. When people see me for the first time, they stare, they laugh, they take pictures. Others are curious. They're tentative when they approach. They want to learn more about me. I'm going to assume that you all fall into that category. I'm 15. The same height as an average 6.5-year-old boy. While the condition is pretty scary, I have a relatively mild form. Those with a severe case may have a spine that grows into the shape of a C, resulting in death from respiratory complications. I have to deal with a lot of symptoms, but a curved spine isn't one of them. Some are really painful, but my life is not in danger. Because of the way my bones grow together and arthritis, it was getting pretty painful to move around. I shared this with my doctor, who said, "You need to start thinking about a mobility device, Brandon." Immediately I thought, there is no way you're putting me into a wheelchair or a scooter. I didn't want to have to spend the rest of my life having to constantly look up at people. Well, I mean, more than I have to already. So the need for assistance was obvious, but I was not going for either of those two options. It took about 2 days, and then a light bulb went off in my head. How cool would it be for me to have something like a Segway? When I went to my parents with this idea, my mom said, "Oh, wow. How much is that gonna cost? And how much is it gonna weigh?" "A lot." My dad said, "You have this idea, so make it happen. If this is what you want, how about you raise the money for it yourself?" I was going to make this happen. The only question was, how? I created a Facebook campaign called Help Brad Move. Has anyone ever seen those orange RVA car magnets? They were part of my fundraising efforts too. For a few months, there was interest in who I am, what I was doing, and why. From this, I gained experience with people and social skills and raised almost $5,000 in the process. That was great, but based on all my research, it wasn't going to be enough. But I was not going to let that discourage me. Just after this, my mom went to a trade show for promotional products. There was this gadget, sort of like this one here, being promoted as a high-end toy for rich people. She took a picture and texted it to me. I was immediately intrigued. Now, to make a long story short, because I only have 4 minutes, This led me down a completely different path than what I originally expected. Instead of not having enough money, I ended up with 2 devices for the money I raised. One that is small and light, and another that comes apart for travel. On this, I can go places that my legs could never carry me. The bottom line is, don't let other people, even a doctor, dictate the experience you're going to have. Take the advice you need. Take the advice you need. Then have the courage to innovate your own solution. I'm 3'8".
Enjoy yourself.
And with this, I'm 4.5 feet tall.
All right. So what were some takeaways that you all got from that video?
For me, the first thing that came to my mind was, what a shame that he had to raise that money on his own. And wouldn't it be awesome if that was covered by, you know, our healthcare plan or something? You know, I think it's a shame, because even in his situation, he had some sort of access to finances, or at least a way to even, you know, think on his own for another option. There are many people that don't even have that. And I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice if they didn't have to raise that money?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a thought that I had as well, that that he definitely should have had access to those whatever he needed without having to fundraise and go to the community, right? Creating a GoFundMe to get services that he needs. Go ahead.
To me, it highlighted his abilities. It didn't highlight his disabilities. It really emphasized what his abilities were.
Yeah, I absolutely agree too. The fact that he was innovative and wasn't going to stop until he got what he needed. Absolutely. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I always thought it was interesting in the end how he said, like, don't even let a doctor stop you, because I think all too often we trust doctors too much, but doctors are people too. They can be discriminatory even if they're not aware of it or not, but they it's important to, like, know yourself well and encourage people with disabilities to know themselves well and to advocate and help them advocate, because sometimes doctors don't do what's best for that person. Maybe they are trying to or not, but to keep in mind that people should know what's best for them and, like, help them make those decisions, not just have someone else, like a doctor dictate what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing that you know what's best for you and just following your gut through on that. Awesome. Let me. So the last 2 slides I have are just if y'all have any questions, and then also my contact information. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or post it in the chat box, and then I'll pull up my contact information.
This is not really a question, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate this. I've always been a self-advocate and advocate for people with disabilities, and I was just really excited when I saw this event on Facebook. I'm like, I gotta go. It's awesome. So I think could be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. I appreciate that. Well, I'll be on for another minute or so if folks have questions. But you can also email me. My email is there on the screen, cporter@ywcamclean.org. If you have any questions, if there's something like, hey, the YW should put on a training or webinar about this, please feel free to reach out to me and we can make that happen. But thank you all for logging on, and be on the lookout for our upcoming webinars and trainings.